scary.
We are scared. We have a lot
We're
of scared. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I feel it actually this week. I feel the scared. So we're going to confront the phantoms of confrontation avoidance. So this episode, we're going to explore how dodging difficult decisions or difficult discussions can lead to more frightening fallout. And the three big things we want to talk about today. So first is to understand the psychology behind the fear of confrontation. And just for everybody who's listening, neither Morgan and I are licensed psychologists or therapists or any of that stuff, but we have opinions about the mind and how it works or doesn't work. The second big thing is techniques for initiating and navigating difficult conversations. And then the third is to the role of emotional intelligence in managing workplace conflicts. So, Morgan, I think, the first question that I have is pretty basic. Like, why does this topic even matter?
There's a variety of poor outcomes that can happen if you're experiencing conflict avoidance. Number one, conflict is needed to get to the best possible outcome. You need differing opinions to get the best possible outcome. It is, to me, inherently good to have challenging conversations with people. So you need that to grow your business. You need that to manage risk in your business. Step one. Step two is if your leadership is engaging in conflict avoidance, everyone that reports to you is feeling that. Excuse me. Because a lot of times your employees might be the one to alert you to the conflict. Like, hey, this thing is happening on this other team and it feels really bad. And I need you, leader. I need you to go in and set the course straight, right? And if you're unable to do that, then everyone sees it and everyone feels it. And it feels like, hey, man, you're not fighting for me. You're not even doing the basics for me to give me cover and safety in my day-to-day job.
Yeah.
And I think really just having open, honest conversations is a key foundation to any business, right? So I feel like if you are going into business with someone, with yourself, you don't have to argue with yourself. You can just be in complete denial all the time. But if you're going to work with other people, this is the skill that you're going to need to make sure that everything stays on track.
Yeah. And the only thing I would add to that is that in our current sort of matrixed managed organizations, the ability to kind of help to move conversations along, to help make decisions, to drive towards conclusions is really, really, really important. And honestly, most of that happens through confrontation, and not confrontation like, the Hatfields and McCoy kind of confrontation. And for those of you young enough not to know what that means, you should Google that. But I think what that does mean is really being able to bring the real issues to the surface and having a conversation about those things.
Yes.
Right? Or else you're just not going to move things forward.
Yeah. I have been doing some deep thinking about conflict avoidance and throughout my whole life, honestly, because my brother was a conflict avoider and I was just the opposite. And you can imagine how our interactions with the parent went, right? Like, he was awesome and I sucked.
Right.
I just leaned into conflict. But that didn't serve him very well. And so I thought about, why do people avoid conflict? And one of the things that I arrived at is maybe they're not scared of the conflict itself, but what the outcome of that conflict might be. So I'm going to use coming out as gay to your parents, because I feel like it's something that people can understand and understand the potential ramifications if that did not have a great outcome. So if I come out gay to my parents, and they say, I don't accept you, right? I think that's the thing you're scared of, right? Not saying the words, but once you say the words, then it's, if they don't accept you, then what? Where are you as a person, and what decisions do you have to make? So to relate this to business now. So if you say to your business partner, I don't like the way you're showing up at business, to the business, and I need you to make these changes, and that person says no, now you're left with something you have to do. That's the scary thing. You have to ask yourself questions. Did I make a terrible decision picking this person as a partner, right? Am I willing to live with this? If I'm not willing to live with it, am I willing to make the very difficult decision of exiting the relationship, right? So I don't think, to me, I feel like, and again, I don't struggle a lot with conflict, but to me, it seems like it's really the outcome that is so terrifying. And that's why you just don't start it. Because if you don't start it, you never have to make those hard decisions, and you never have to like confront the reality of what you're left with after those conversations happen.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And I think there's this whole the devil you know kind of mentality, like the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. And so there's a little bit of an attachment to the status quo. And right, Daniel Kahneman, right, he wrote that book, Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow. He just passed away recently, but he won a Nobel Prize and all that stuff. And he talks about this notion of something like the status quo bias, and how we want to kind of stick to the way that it is, even though it may not be exceptionally beneficial to us. So I think it feels like there's a lot of that going on, especially with how busy we are. And I think the other thing to me is it's a function of the culture of the organization as well. So like as leaders, we have to set the tone to make it okay to have kind of that honest conversation, confrontation, but with always assuming or always coming at it with positive intent to some degree.
Yeah, and we talked about this in a previous podcast about toxic positivity and happy talk. And I think, if you're in a group of humans where their default is to never talk about anything negative, then that's what the group becomes comfortable with, right? But if you're with a group of people that just puts all their cards on the table, and it's not weird, right? If you start with the culture of saying this isn't working, or hey, Anil, you did this thing the other day and here's how it impacted me. Can we talk about that? Blah, 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 right? And so if it's just part of the way you run your business, it is no longer weird, right? It's just having that conversation. So I'm with you. It starts at the very, very beginning, and it starts at the top to kind of normalize that behavior.
Yeah. And so what are some strategies that we can recommend to kind of prepare for potentially confrontational conversation?
Well, I think there's two sides, right? So there's the strategy that you would use as the person who's wanting to bring up the subject. And then there's the strategy of the person listening. So I think for the person that wants to bring up the topic, it's important to do a little research, especially if you're uncomfortable. We've got a bunch of books that we can recommend in this podcast that will be very helpful, but there are right and wrong ways to approach conflict. You can screw things up by going, you suck, right? You need to show up like a professional. And to the fullest extent possible, remove your emotions from the conversation, which is way easier said than done. This is one of the things I struggle with because, man, sometimes I come out swinging and I got to dial that back sometimes. It's like, okay, how can I say this in a professional and actionable way?
Yeah.
Right? How can I say this that the person can react in a positive way rather than feel like they just got backed into a corner? So I would say preparation is a huge part of just trying to figure out how am I going to have this conversation, maybe run it by a friend. I know that you and I have used each other for sounding boards in the past. It's like, hey, I'm about to say this thing. Do you think I'm going to get fired? So, right. So it's helpful to have a trusted friend that you can bounce things off of.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
What do you think about the other side? What would you recommend to the people hearing that feedback?
Well, I mean, I think there's a couple things from my mind, right? Look, one is I think we have to get good at, and we were talking about this in the intro about emotional intelligence, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of research that kind of talks about that sort of as a really important aspect of working or being with other people. Daniel Goleman is the person who kind of coined that phrase, emotional intelligence. And there's a great book by Travis Bradberry. It's called Emotional Intelligence 2.0. And he really talks about this notion of the 4 parts, right? The self-awareness, like I understand who I am. Self-management, I can kind of regulate my emotions to some extent. Social awareness, like read the room kind of thing. And then relationship management, like really caring for the relationship. And so if you're in an environment where that sort of conversation is likely to happen, it's important to kind of get a sense for yourself of how you are and how you react to things. And I think the other thing that I'll mention is, I know this sounds a little woo-woo, but this notion of positive intent, right? I think it's really important to make sure that you're not kind of believing that person is attacking you or undermining you in the moment. Yeah. Like afterwards, sure, maybe, but in the moment, you gotta really believe that that's something that's being shared with you for a good reason.
Man, that's scary. Like, no, I'm having real talk here because, like, if there's a history of the person being irrational or not pleasant to deal with,
yeah,
I mean, that feels very dangerous to put yourself in that kind of positive intent. It almost feels like you're opening yourself up to risk.
Yeah.
What advice do you have about that?
Well, I mean, I think you are, right? I think that's the short answer is you are opening yourself up for risk. But you do that all the time, right? With your significant other, with your kid, with your neighbor. And it's the only way to get to the heart of whatever the issue is. And I think how do you prepare yourself for that? Practice, right? You don't, right? I mean, I think, so my wife and I have been married for a long time, and I still get defensive with her. I love her. I trust her. I would jump in front of a moving car for her, but she brings something up that I'm still the 12-year-old child that gets defensive.
But oh my gosh. Yeah.
I recognize that faster, I hope. Or I come back later and I'm able to deal with it. So
yeah, I need to run away. Like when I get unexpected confrontation, I'm like, yeah, I need to go pout for like a day. Can I get back to you on this when I'm an adult again?
Yeah.
And I think that's okay too, to say that's a lot. I mean, that's a lot to process I need time to process that. I don't think you necessarily have to react on the spot. I think it's okay to give yourself permission to step away and work through it.
Yeah. I think it's important to do that. And I think that's how you kind of increase the likelihood that that you're going to get a positive outcome, I think. Right. Mm-hmm. So are there other things that we can do to ensure that confrontation leads to a positive outcome?
I think I'm going back to normalizing this whole thing. I think anytime you're talking about the business or you're having check-ins or statuses, I think just put it in there, kind of like what's working, what's not working. Like just normalize the heck out of it. So you're always talking about what's working, and it starts to take the emotion out of it. Like everyone's talking about things that are not working. There's no one's sitting there in judgment. As a business, we need to make business decisions. And this, is not a personal thing. This is a business decision, and, we're going to work through it. So I think it's less likely to turn out poorly if you are in the habit of talking about things that aren't working.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you want to set up those as a matter of course, right? So, right in the organization that I work in, you formerly were working there, it's end of quarter. And so there's good things that happen at the end of quarter and not so good things that happen at end of quarter. And I think one of the things that we're instituting is just that, right? Like, let's go back and take a look at how could we have done this differently, or what about what we did worked? And I think that's healthy, right? Not from the aspect of like, Anil, you totally foobarred this, and that's because you're an asshole. And although that's probably true, I think it's important for us to say, here's what you did that worked. Here's what you did that didn't. Mm-hmm. And to learn from those, right? I think that's a really important tactic. I think the other thing is, to me, is to have a common language around conflict. Because, right, as somebody that we know and maybe don't love, words matter, right? That's, but they do matter, right? And I think it's important for us to have that common, that common vernacular when we're talking about things and sharing things. That really helps with positive intent.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think when we look at the whole picture, like, hey, don't do conflict avoidance, bad things can happen. I'd like to dial that in just a little bit about what is the mechanism of conflict avoidance and the downstream implications in that. And this is from a relationship perspective, and like husband and wife, significant others, whatever, the business partners, whatever the case may be. When someone is doing something that's not working for you and you don't say something, then you start to get resentful, right? I'm following the rules, and this jackass over here is not following the rules. And I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to tolerate it, but I'm resentful, right? Because I'm in this place, they're in that place, and I resent them for that. But I'm unwilling to say anything about it, right? And then that resentment gets really built up in you, and it feels icky. And so you start to disengage, right? And again, it could be at work. It could be a spouse, right? So you have all these feelings, and you're like, no, I can't do this. So you start to distance yourself from the thing, whether it's a work thing or a spouse or significant other. And so you're protecting yourself by creating this emotional buffer with that thing or that person. And then ultimately, the relationship as a whole starts to deteriorate, right? You start being disrespectful to one another because you're both disengaged and resentful, right? So you're not going to show up with love and respect if that's where your head's at. So this cycle of resentment and then disengagement and then deterioration, that's at the interpersonal level and at a business level, and just no good can come from it. So as you know, my personal approach, I over rotate on just saying that's not working for me. Like immediately, I'm like, nope, that's not going to work for me. But it gets it out there like immediately, and so you can have that conversation. Because I value my relationships. I don't want to go through that downward spiral of resentment and disengagement. That just is the worst feeling ever.
Yeah, I think that's such a good way to frame it, right? That you become disengaged. And, I think it goes back to that whole notion of you have to create a culture of saying things is okay. Mm-hmm. And you have to have a common language around how do I say this in order to, so that it comes across in the right way. And, my wife's so good at like, when something's not working, she just says like, this isn't working. Mm-hmm. And, it just gets it out in the open. And I think that that's such an important thing. And it's part of what creates that toxic culture when nobody feels like they have the bandwidth or the authority or the ability to just kind of to call a spade a spade. Like, look, this isn't working. And it's not because I don't love you. It's just, it's not working. And so we need to figure it out.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there's a flip side of that is that if you say, okay, now it's working, did I fix it? And you say, yes, that yes has to be legitimate. Right. Yeah. So we're getting into the relationship, but my husband and I, we made an agreement that no matter what the tone of my voice is when I say it, you can believe the words that are said. Right. So if I say I'm fine, right, the agreement is no matter how bitchy it sounds when I say that, that means I am okay. I will get there. Right. I will get there. But I should never say I'm fine if I'm not fine, because that's not fair to him, because then they don't know what they're dealing with. So we had to make that rule. Whatever comes out of your mouth, the words are the words, the emotions are irrelevant.
Yeah. But I think that's an important rule to kind of establish in your working relationships as well. And I think it goes back to like, what's your mission, vision, and values? And what's the ultimate objective of the business that you're in? And if you can kind of use that as a guide, as a North Star, then that's going to be really helpful. So I know there's a ton of books and materials and stuff that are out there. I know we're going to share a laundry list of good things with folks. Any kind of last words around how to kind of help with driving down conflict avoidance, or just increasing the likelihood that we're going to share things in a real way?
I think just normalizing it and baking it into your business. I think the challenge is if you're not already doing that, you have to make that pivot, and how to make that pivot from a culture of not sharing those things to a culture of sharing those things. And I think you can set it up and just say, hey, look, we are going to start talking about things that aren't working, and everyone's going to participate in this process.
Yeah.
Morgan, what's not working for you? Anil, what's not working for you? And you do that a few times, people are going to start getting used to the feeling of talking about things that are not working. But there are people and companies out there that are going to have to make the pivot from a state where they're not sharing that kind of stuff.
Yeah, agreed. And I think the only thing I would add to that is you also want to make the space to say what is working and why it's working. right? I think that's the other piece. It's not just like, yay, you. It's like, yay, you, but here's why. And we also have to take into account cultural differences, right? I mean, not all cultures are set up in the same way where they're willing to tell a senior leader or a peer what's up, really. It's easy for us not easy. It's more accepted in the United States, that we just sort of say things because we're kind of uncouth, unfiltered, and all that kind of stuff. And people in the rest of the world are maybe more refined. And so I think we have to just all take those kind of things into account.
For sure.
Yeah. Cool. All right. Well, so we've got a ton of materials that we're going to share with you. At the end of this, you'll see that in the show notes. And Morgan, thank you for making me feel a little less scared about confrontation.
You're very welcome.
All right, everybody. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time on Monster in My Closet.